Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Xander, and I'm here with Abby, our political reporter. What is the news of the afternoon that we're going to talk about, Abby? You've been on top of this.
It's a very long-running story, but essentially, to sum it up, the UK government used a Section 35 order, which is a little-known part of the Scotland Act, to stop Scotland's gender reforms from becoming law when they passed in Holyrood last year, which I cannot believe was a year ago, but it was actually a year ago. It was last December, and that has now been upheld by the Court of Session, which is Scotland's highest court, which means that the UK government were basically in the right to do that. So there's a lot of reaction coming in. We're still waiting on hearing from the Scottish government at the moment, but this has just been a massive story that's been going on for years now, actually, to be honest. So yeah, it's a big day, a momentous occasion for it to finally come through.
Yeah. So as you say, the Court of Session has ruled that Alister Jack could block the gender reforms, but do the Scottish government have any leave to appeal here, or what's the next steps from their perspective?
Yeah, so that is basically the next step. They either decide whether or not they're going to appeal it or if they're going to drop it, basically. They've already spent about £230,000 on legal fees, kind of fighting this and taking it to the Court of Session. So it would go up to the next stage, and then it'll probably rumble on to the Supreme Court. Like, this could probably last till the end of next year if the Scottish government do want to push through with this and see it right to the end, because I think what the likelihood of that, though, is a bit up in there. I think if the Scottish government had won the first stage, if they'd won it this time, but they haven't, the UK government have, the UK government definitely would have appealed it, and it probably would have rumbled on to the Supreme Court. Whether or not the Scottish government's going to do it is the question. We're really waiting on this statement from them this morning. That's kind of like I've just been texting people like, is there any idea of when this is coming? Like, do we know what the update is? Because we've already heard from LGBT charities who are saying that they should pursue the appeal, they should go for it, and they should push it. And then obviously the people on the other side who were not supportive of the bill are saying they should drop it. So, we're just kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place at the moment, waiting to see what the next step is from the Scottish government.
Yeah, it's hard not to get a tinge of hypocrisy from the Conservatives demanding that the Scottish government listens to the court, considering that they are currently in the process of trying to circumvent the Supreme Court's ruling on Rwanda. So it seems that the Conservatives are adamant that the SNP should be listening to the court as long as the court's saying what it wants them to.
Yes, but Douglas Ross has also said that he's going to support that bill. So it'll be ironic to see what he comes in and says about that, when we should obviously, when you think about the Supreme Court ruling on independence, we have to abide by that too. So interesting that there's a bit of a double standard there going on.
So the groups that you mentioned that are pushing the Scottish government to appeal this ruling, as you said, we don't know if they will do. I think, did you say earlier they have 21 days?
21 days, yeah. They've got 21 days to appeal. So, I mean, whether or not we're going to get an immediate reaction to that, I'm assuming, I don't know. I don't want to assume anything at this point on a Friday. But yeah, I think it'll be quite crucial to find out when.
Yeah. I think you probably would expect them to take a bit of time. I'd be very surprised if they announced an appeal today. But the LGBT groups that are pushing for this appeal, on what grounds are they saying that the decision could be refuted?
Well, I think it's the real kind of crux of the issue here. I've had a very brief reading of the 65-page document about that the Court of Sessions put out, Lady Haldane. But then one of the key arguments that was had during the 2-day hearing that we had in September was that this impacted the Equality Act, the UK-wide Equality Act, and the Gender Reform Act, the 2004 one, which is UK-wide, that was introduced by Labour. So that was one of the key arguments, was that it would impact that, and Lady Haldane has backed that up and said it would kind of impact parts of that law. So I think that's where they might try and fight the ground on this, because that has been the big contention of would it or would it not impact the UK-wide law, and I think that's what they would want to challenge. And also, gender reforms has devolved to the Scottish Parliament, so it's not as if the Scottish government were legislating in an area that they weren't allowed to, like the UNCRC, which did go to the Supreme Court, did get refused, and then yesterday we had the amended bill put forward, and that passed, but had a lot of changes to it because it had to fit within the devolved aspects. A lot of it was international, so that didn't count, and we had to kind of go back to the drawing board with that. But for gender reforms, that was within the law. There is ability for the Scottish government to do that. It's just because there's this conflict, and Alister Jack has said that it affects UK-wide law. There was also a lot of discussion about whether or not this was on policy grounds that the Tories were challenging this, because if you've seen any of the rhetoric coming out of Westminster at the moment, we saw Kemi Badenoch earlier in the week basically just saying that they're going to take a number of countries off of lists that have approved GRCs, that have adopted self-identification, which is basically what the bill would allow transgender people to do. That's kind of the main issue here, is that Lady Haldane said that while they probably, they couldn't prove that in court. They suggested it, and she could tell that the petitioners, the Scottish government, believed it, but they didn't have enough evidence that that was why Jack had made the decision.
Yeah, I was reading as you said, I mean, this briefing was published, not briefing, this ruling was published about an hour ago now, basically to the minute. So we haven't given it the most in-depth reading ever, but I did see that one of the reasons that the judge gave Alister Jack for believing that this might impact on UK-wide law was that he only had a few weeks to look at it.
That was one of the arguments that was kind of come up during the 2-day hearing as well. Basically, that they were trying to say, we only had 2 weeks to look at this. But the Scottish government's argument was, well, this has been coming for like 6 years, because this is a bill that went through 2 different consultation processes. It went on for a long time. It's not as if anybody was kept in the dark about what's going to happen, or if there was some massive change at the last minute. It pretty much stayed the same the entire way through the bill, which I covered last year. I mean, I was there for every day of the last 3 days of it. There were barely any amendments that passed. There were like little things about provisions for sex offenders and things like that, just very kind of minute things that were taken in, but there wasn't any like massive kind of huge change to the bill. So saying that they only had 2 weeks to consider the implications of it is a bit ridiculous, to be honest, because they had years. Like they had been sent briefing papers. They could have asked the Scottish Parliament for the information way before 2 weeks after it was passed, because that's what they had. Because I think the UK government had a certain amount of time to delay the Section 35 order. So they're saying that they only had the time between when the bill passed and when they had to have that order late to look at it. And it's like, well, why weren't you looking at it before?
I mean, the appeals process you were mentioning earlier could go on for a long, long time. That could be extremely interesting, because this ruling today was from the outer house of the Court of Session. So normally appeals from there would be considered in the inner house of the Court of Session, and then appeals from there would go to the Supreme Court. So we could hypothetically see a Labour government finish this case defending the Scottish Secretary now, the Conservative Scottish Secretary's decision. But whether or not it will be appealed, we will see. I was reading comments from the Greens, who have basically raised concerns that this ruling shows the huge limitations and constraints on devolution. They're saying that this actually has a much wider impact than only on gender reform. And what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, they're not. Wrong there. I mean, think about it. When has the UK government can it ever be? Okay. So, the only time that the UK government has, as I said, talking about the UNCRC, there have been a couple of challenges in recent years to legislation, but, nothing to the extent of using a Section 35 order. I mean, I think a lot of people, including, journalists who work in this area, didn't know that part of the Scotland Act existed, or that it could be used in this way. And you think if they've been allowed to do it for this in an area that are allowed to legislate on, what comes next? What if a Tory or a Labour government decide that they don't agree with something that Scotland's doing? Do they just unilaterally now be able to use this really as an excuse to say, well, we can do it as long as we do it within these parameters? Because that was the whole point of the Court of Session and why it was such a big case, was this Section 35 hadn't been used before. So it's like, what are the limitations of that, and what can they actually do, and how far can they push it, and how often can it be used? So I think that's the big concern from the Greens. I can completely understand where they're coming from, because it could have an impact on, we've seen, for example, we saw Alba last week having their thing about potentially bringing another referendum on, whether or not Holyrood should be able to have the powers. Could they intervene and strike down stuff like that if we wanted to, take a different look on independence, or look at other policies that maybe we wanted to bring in that don't necessarily fit in with Westminster's, rhetoric at the moment, or whoever's in charge then, instead of doing things that Scotland actually would quite want to do and that have been voted for in the Scottish Parliament elections. People have been elected to go into that Parliament to create laws that were in manifestos. The gender reforms were part of that. It passed cross-party. So, what does that mean now, that Scotland just has to get permission from Westminster every time we want to pass a bill? It's going to be a nightmare.
It definitely seems like there are going to be big ramifications for devolution from this. And it's been one of the more interesting parts of the gender debate in terms of the way it will impact on devolution. Often you will have seen the pro-independence people, who tend to have very strong pro-devolution views, accepting and celebrating the Section 35 order, which seems a little bizarre in context.
Yeah, it's I guess it depends really where you stand on the gender reforms with that one, whether or not you want to see that. It's been a very divisive issue. There's no kind of glossing over that at all. It's caused a lot of divisions within, pro-independence parties, within unionists. It kind of has gone across those party lines. I think it's something that's not going to end now. This isn't going to be an issue that goes away. It's probably not going to stop being so divisive. I mean, anybody who's on social media at the moment can see this. I mean, we've had the culture war stuff coming from Westminster. So, yeah, it's a bit of a tough one. But, I can understand why. I can understand from those people's perspective why they would want that intervention. I mean, we've seen people who really disagree with it and just do not want it to happen. But that's what elections are for. As I said, it was across the party passed by the Parliament.
Yeah, it might be a case of be careful what you wish for, and the people that are happy to have the Section 35 blocking this particular law maybe won't be quite so happy when it's used again in future, which this ruling does seem to open the door to that. But yes, we will wait and see what happens. As you said, 21 days, so 3 weeks for the Scottish Government to decide whether or not to appeal. It will probably go to the Inner House, and then if they were to win, it would be up to the UK government to appeal to the Supreme Court. So, yeah, as you said, this definitely doesn't feel like it's over just yet. We will see, and we will be, basically bringing you every scrap of news that we can on this issue, and of course everything else as well. But everything's on the national.scot already. We've reported on the initial gender reforms being blocked. We've got reaction from the groups that Abby mentioned earlier, pushing for the appeal. We've got the UK government and the Conservatives' statements on it and how to read the full ruling. Really, we've got you covered when it comes to the gender.
We will have the Scottish government when it eventually comes.
Which hopefully will be. Have we actually heard?
I've said anytime now. I was told 10 minutes ago. So
yeah, that's. Oh, sorry, I was reading the comments popped up on the bottom. Have we heard anything from the Labour Party in Scotland? I've actually closed my emails because otherwise it will ping.
I've not got anything from them. I've had a look. I mean, not that I can see. Let me just have a quick check before we go. Oh, wait, Labour's Shadow Secretary, Scottish Secretary Ian Murray said, it's disappointing this legislation ended up in the courts, but this ruling should be respected. It is shameful that after years of debate, trans people feel no more protected and women no more reassured. This is another demonstration of why both governments have to work together rather than spending taxpayers' money fighting in the courts and pitting communities against each other.
That's interesting. So, because Scottish Labour supported this legislation, Anna Sawar whipped his MSPs to vote for it. So now we have Ian Murray saying that the ruling of the court should be respected. So this Labour Scottish Secretary is saying that the bill which the Scottish Labour supported, God, they're in a bit of a mess, I think. Labour
both government. He always does this sort of both governments just like blame everybody else, and Labour are kind of like, we're not going to actually say anything of substance, really. Like, that's usually Ian Murray's tactic when it comes to the gender reforms thing. So it'll be more interesting to see what Anna Sawar says if we get a statement from him or, their equality spokespeople as well. Because there were a couple of people in Scottish Labour who they either abstained or they voted against it and they lost their front bench positions. I think two front benchers lost their positions and two people conveniently were not in the Parliament.
Given absence slips, weren't they? But anyway, we won't go on too long.
I thought I'd just check that we
need to get back. That was a good question, though. I've forgotten the name when it popped up, but thanks for asking that because, we didn't know until that minute what Labour were saying.
It literally came in. That came in at 10 minutes ago, a couple of I think when we started this live stream. So it's perfect timing. Thank you.
So, thanks everybody for watching, for tuning in. As I said, there's so much coverage of this on our website and so many other stories as well. So, the national.scot. Thanks very much. We will leave it there.